Hello. I guess we're next.
Sorry.
Sure.
Having a foot fight already.
Exactly. You know, what a fascinating morning. I am a newbie here at FiRe. In fact, really just recently found out about it. I asked Mark if I could come, and he suddenly recruits me to be on stage here. So thank you very much, Mark. And I'm fascinated by a sort of spectrum that is developing over the morning here, and in fact is developing in society. In the fact that we are moving on so many fronts from science fiction to science reality. And various topics that we're discussing here at this meeting are in various stages of moving from that transition, from the kind of shows and programs and things we watched as children. And for me, a guy who covers healthcare, bioscience mostly, it's interesting to be talking to Dan Faulkner here from Nuance, because the whole voice recognition realm, which Nuance is primarily involved with, and it is really sort of snuck up on, I think, a lot of us. I'm not following it really closely. I am a little bit in the medical space. But that science fiction to science reality is happening in almost a routine way now in so many areas. And what I wanted to first ask you about is really just to lay out where we are. And I do feel like we had some preludes in some of the previous discussions, especially the last one. But maybe give us a landscape of where we are.
I'd be happy to do that. And I'm also a newbie, so I'm very happy to be here for my first FiRe conference. So the challenges that we're trying to solve at Nuance are really about making the human to computer, the human to machine interface as seamless, unobtrusive, intuitive, and easy as possible. And to do that, it has to be a holistically usable interface. I'll come back to what I mean by that in a second. And it also has to be a holistically functional interface. They're the two sort of themes that I would emphasize. I'll explain them more in just a second. And it's far more than speech. So recognizing speech, being able to accurately ingest an audio signal and get it down into text is something we've been doing for a long time. We've been able to transcribe audio in 60, 80 languages for years now. And it hasn't been the confounding factor in the real adoption of these virtual assistant, personal assistant capabilities. As Peter was just talking about, there's a strong AI component to it. So the speech recognition is one angle. Text-to-speech synthesis, the ability of the system to speak back to you, is really important as well. So it's not much good if something's giving you great data, but you can't understand it, you can't follow it. It's incredibly tedious to listen to. It actually has to be really quite natural for people to accept. Also, there are many, many instances where you might not want to talk. And there are social instances where you may not want to talk. So as much as we're all friends here, it would be slightly strange if one of you got out your phone and just started having a full volume conversation. If you needed urgently to talk to somebody, you might text them. So there's all sorts of inputs and outputs, and on smart devices, we've got our multi-touch gesture and handwriting and swipe kind of input. So all of those input and output mechanisms need to be really robust. Underneath that, you need to be able to have a conversation. And I mean have a conversation. One of the areas where I think we may have seen perhaps a misstep in what people think the first generation of personal assistants were able to do is they tend to be very one-shot. So search the web for X, set up a meeting with this person at such and such a time. And it's sophisticated command and control. But when you go into some of the broader areas, like healthcare, imagine a personal assistant for a physician, or into customer care, where you want to have a conversation about your account, it becomes exponentially more complex. And you need to encode a huge amount of knowledge into a conversational system that's robust. You can imagine if you try and anticipate in advance all the different ways a conversation might go and hard code them all, you're done. It's never going to work. So you need a system that's kind of inherently robust and intelligent enough to conduct a conversation with a human, given the vagaries of how we talk. Speech is so intuitive to us, but actually we carry around all sorts of context. Some of that's real world. So if I was to say, hey, why don't we meet tomorrow at 3? You know I don't mean 3 a.m. It would be really strange if I called you at 3 a.m.
Hopefully not.
Likewise, if I was to say out of context, how about an arm? It doesn't mean anything. If it's in the context of a conversation where I just said, what's the interest rate for a 30-year fixed rate mortgage, it suddenly makes sense because we have the conversational context. In addition, we have the situational context. Where are you? Are you in a car? Because then you want to be talking a lot. Are you in front of a big TV screen? Because then you could be using the real estate of that screen to show data. And then the context of who you are, your long-term preferences, all sorts of stuff that feeds our natural conversations that we start to need to be able to encode into a longer-term conversation. And that, to me, is where we've made some of the most exciting advances recently, is in the conversational dialogue capability. And I think that's where that's one of the more profound areas of research and advancement that's going to take this forward.
Well, I wonder, jumping ahead in this kind of sci-fi to reality, what is the ultimate goal here? I mean, there's been already discussion about the movie Her, and there were some fascinating aspects of that in many ways. One of the sort of scarier parts was all the people standing on the subway with their little jigger in their ear, just chatting with their Scarlett Johansson, hello, and no one was interacting or anything. But where does this all lead? Is it Star Trek where you walk into the room and you start talking to the room that makes you tea and does various things? Where are we headed with this?
So actually, yes, I think we will have smart homes. But one key question that people often jump to, and it's a presumption, people say, when will we have a personal assistant that's just totally human? And I don't think we've proven yet that that's what people want. I think they want something that's really intelligent and really helpful, but that's a different thing. Actually, you might argue that's inherently not human. But if we stay on the angle of real intelligence, real helpfulness, what I said when I talked about holistic functionality, what I mean is I want to be able to solve any problem at any given time, whether that's a question to the web or turning my thermostat up or asking for directions to a great restaurant while I'm driving, or composing an email on my phone. And for us to get there, the theme of this conference is leaving borders behind. We need to. We need to leave the borders of the parochial interests of individual operating systems and individual devices behind, ultimately. Just a quick show of hands, how many people in here have more than one of the following product lines that you use? So Apple, Android, Microsoft. Hands up if you have more than one of those. Okay, great. So.
How many don't? That's some.
Well, yeah, I guess.
One guy up here, I think. Ben, did you raise your hand?
My point there is this. Your Cortana experience is different to your Siri experience, right? And when you get smart TVs, you have an experience there. And when you get cars with virtual assistants, you have a different experience there. The onus is on you to learn where are the boundaries, what are the capabilities, what can I do with this experience that I can't do with that experience. And I think that's just going to fundamentally impede the progress that we could otherwise be making. And I think there's a real opportunity for the people who are working in this space to make it a gigantic collaborative effort because it's called a personal assistant. It's your assistant. It should come with you. And you should be able to have that experience whether you're talking to a smart TV and the car and the phone, and it doesn't matter what those brands are, because it's your personal assistant and it's there to help you. That's how I think this needs to go, which brings me back to the point of holistic functionality. If you think about the gigantic amount of content, we talk about big data, we need big knowledge, right? Big understanding of that data. There's all sorts of content out there. There are all sorts of real-time data resources, and of course, as individuals, we all have our own interests. So to accommodate that, you need a degree of universality in access and experience. And that, I think, is achievable. And I hope that that is where we end up, where there's something that's above the technology layer and is perhaps its own ecosystem.
Right. I was about to use the word ecosystem. And in fact, I think that is a big encumbrance. In fact, having so many devices, it drives me crazy. In my briefcase, I have 5 or 6 different charger cables. Just got a new Mac. It's got yet another cable. And, there's some very practical considerations around all this. But back to where this technology is, just one more question on that. As a health tech reporter, I've done several articles on actually using thought and people who are quadriplegic or paralyzed, and there have been a few people, there's been experiments where you've actually put implants in their brains, and it's very clunky, doesn't work all that well. Is that too far out for you guys to even think about, where you would actually be using thought?
It's funny, I will tell you it's not something we're working on in earnest now.
It's not a back room back there somewhere, which has its own kind of scary implications too. But
it does. I mean, but to your point, we actually cast the net very wide, and we think you have to cast the net very wide when you're thinking about personal assistance in terms of inputs and outputs. So there was a period, I think, where we would have defined ourselves as just speech. But we really don't. We think of ourselves as a personal assistant company, and that means really start with the user. If you think about all the different ways people want to interact and the types of knowledge they're going to get, you have to have a very broad canvas.
Yeah, let's talk about Nuance for a second. In reading a little bit about the history, it's fascinating. It apparently started with Ray Kurzweil long ago. You had various iterations, and we're talking about the technology, but this is a company that's started small. People probably thought it was a little crazy when it started out, the whole idea of speech recognition. It's now, close to $2 billion in revenues. The industry, I think I looked this up, is approaching $58 billion, up from $38 billion just, in 2010. Where is this all heading? Are you having a convergence, as you were describing? What will be the size of this industry, and what will it look like?
Well, I think that the virtual assistant space, if we use that as the catch-all for all those technologies that are underneath, I think has almost unbounded potential for growth, because as Peter mentioned, it's driving fundamental research in some areas that are extremely repurposable and challenging. And it has so many commercial applications. And then, of course, you can multiply anything that you do by the couple of hundred languages that it needs to be deployed in, and the numerous dialects that all need to be supported. But I will tell you that there isn't a company that I talk to today who doesn't have this kind of capability on their agenda somewhere, whether that's people in the ecosystem building those solutions, or whether it's companies who want to use them or build their own version of them, or get a version, get it integrated.
Yeah. Start thinking about questions here. We'll come to that in a few minutes. We've been sort of bouncing along on this topic of some of the more maybe sinister aspects of some of this technology, and in terms of like her, the people standing, not interacting. Is there any fear in your mind, somebody in this industry who thinks a lot about it, will this change, or has it already changed, human to human interaction? How will it affect it? Is it an augmentation, or is it a profound change?
I don't think it's virtual assistants that will have that kind of impact. I think it's arguable that maybe smartphones did.
Well, will you fall in love with your, personal assistant?
Personally, I don't think you'll fall in love with your personal assistant.
Like in Her. Those of you who haven't seen Her, you're not going to get about it.
And certainly you won't fall in love with it the way that guy does. But that's not how I think this will end up. I think it has I think it will be extremely helpful, extremely productive. It's about efficiency in terms of communication. Actually, one of the main areas we see people, most active areas we see people using virtual assistants is for communication. It's for messaging. It's very convenient when a message arrives to immediately have it read to you and then to dictate your response back. So in some senses, I think it can enhance how people communicate and the speed with which they communicate. I think, the more profound change was probably the advent of smartphones, and people look at them something like 150 to 200 times a day. Was the average from the research that I've seen. That's a lot of time not to be talking to someone else.
Yeah. Is there a chance that as these devices start talking back to us more? I wonder about like advertising messages, and you're already having a problem with people, elderly, others getting these messages, and they, advertising messages. I mean, is there a potential for abuse, really, of some of these systems?
In the sense that there are enabling technologies there that are fairly fundamental, yes, anything can be abused. We actually have developed something that we call voice ads, where we integrated the virtual assistant capability into mobile phone advertisements, but they're optional. It's not like you look at the ad and it starts shouting at you. You can actually engage with it though and have a conversation and play little games, and there's a lot of interest in that area from the advertising space.
Yeah, and just to talk for a minute about healthcare, and then we've got a couple of people lined up here.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about how you work. I think you all are involved with IBM with Watson, which I've spent some time studying, and obviously the voice recognition part of that software, whether it was Jeopardy or now Watson, has actually gone back, is in medical school right now. I was up at the Cleveland Clinic recently, and they're literally sending Watson, having it do the same training as a human physician. And so describe what you all are doing with that, and how that world, partly how that world works, but how it will actually get out into the mainstream of medicine.
Sure. I mean, I think it's arguable that we're fairly mainstream in medicine already. It's a very successful business.
Things like doctor's notes, things like
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we started out transcribing doctor's notes, medical records, and similarly to how I talked about Nuance more generally, started with speech, evolved into these intelligent systems. Once you've captured what the doctor said, if you can turn that into data, it becomes infinitely more powerful and valuable. And so we've invested heavily in an area that we call clinical language understanding. We also have substantial research relationships in the medical community with a number of hospitals. And that is doing the kind of thing that you'd expect, getting massive medical ontologies, building out language models, conversational models. So we're doing a few things. One of the areas we're focused on at the moment is making the industry more efficient. So we're able to code automatically the documents that have been captured from the physician's speech, and both maximize those codes, make sure they're accurate with the, the new ICD-10 standard, and we also have a really interesting area called clinical documentation improvement, which is a little earlier but really cool, which is essentially imagine the ability where a system can go back to the doctor and say, look, you said this person's got a sallow complexion, brittle hair, big bags under the eyes, et cetera, but you haven't said they're malnourished. And if you don't say they're malnourished, you don't get a code, and you don't get your money from the insurance company. So it can suggest changes. Now, of course, it's really important that only the physician can change anything.
Right.
But
so you have to send the physicians back to school.
That's right. But the whole drive in that business is free up physician time to spend more time treating patients, slow down the thrash between the medical institutions and the insurance companies, and just try and unstick the gears a bit in the industry. And that clinical language understanding will absolutely play into, I believe, medical-based, physician-oriented virtual assistants.
Right. All right, let's turn to some, we have a few minutes for questions. Why don't we start over here?
Hi, Nelson Hiller, Hiller Results Group. Two kind of related questions. Is this presumably all cloud-based, web-based, or will there be subsets of it that will be built into the device? And if it is cloud-based, is it just a garden variety?
Nothing we do is garden variety.
Okay. How do you protect it from crashing somewhere out there in the cloud?
Yeah. I'm glad you asked that question. Something I should have mentioned. We have both. We have a big embedded business. Yes, we have something we call Nuance Cloud Services, which is the NLU and speech and conversational dialogue stack, which we host. But we're on billions of devices, sometimes with totally embedded systems, sometimes with clients that speak to that cloud as things become more connected. And you can see from our vantage point, we're looking across all of those operating systems and devices and brands and thinking this should all be together. This should just be one ecosystem. In terms of stability and SLAs and availability of the service, I think like an awful lot of the companies who are working here, we invest heavily in redundancy, multi-tenancy, and it's pretty critical if you're providing high quality services that it's always available.
That's probably a bigger problem than just what you all are doing.
It's another industry.
And let's keep these brief if we can. Yes.
Hi, Sean Bowe with the Institute for Systems Biology. I'm interested in following up on the healthcare question because in the medical systems, we've actually seen a change now where they're actually pairing doctors with transcriptionists because the physicians are pushing back on trying to do data entry in any shape or form. It's taking them away from the patient experience. So I'm curious, as you look at that trend, whether it be short-term or medium-term, how do you marry the interest of trying to keep a patient experience that's very focused and at the same time allowing for these real-time sort of input mechanisms to play a role in productivity?
Yeah, it's a great question. We get extremely good feedback from physicians. It's something that's pulled rather than pushed for the solution that we offer. We do two flavors. I'll keep it brief because I know we're running short of time. Two flavors. There's a front-end flavor, which means as the physician's talking, the transcription appears. They can, and funnily enough, some physicians really like that because they can show the patient this is what's going in your medical record in real time during the appointment. We also have back-end systems, which is more of a workflow, where they may record something, it will be transcribed later on, and then at the end of the day, they'll review what they've done. So we really haven't seen that kind of pushback. And I would argue if you've got to have a transcriptionist tailing a doctor around, there's an opportunity to do that more efficiently.
Yeah, I would think physicians are more used to this because they, unlike other industries, have always, at least
that's right.
Since we've had recording devices, that's how they've worked.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, Ben.
It's Vince Cerf again. I want you to react to the following picture. A lot of what we've talked about is a personal assistant talking to the user, and so there's this user experience interaction going on. Imagine there are two different people who have personal assistants that are enabled, for example, by Nuance technology. But now let's ask the question, is there anything that we could do to allow the two personal assistant programs to interact with each other? On top of that, you've commented, and Peter as well, that context is very important for understanding as well as recognizing speech. And so now you can imagine that this little box that says PA on it also has access to a body of information that helps it understand what is uttered in context. So now we've got two different things going on here. We have a shared, this is your collaboration thing again, we have this shared body of information that helps the personal assistant use context to understand what's going on. And we have another possibility of, let me use the word protocol here, between the personal assistants to allow them to accomplish the tasks that they've now undertaken. It feels to me like there are some really basic representational challenges here. You're familiar with KL1 and all those other, knowledge language 1, which was an attempt to represent knowledge. People have been talking, and you and others have said we should be collaborating, and I agree with that. It feels to me like there are some really basic infrastructural designs that need to be developed in order to enable this kind of sharing of information. So I don't know if this is a poorly worded question, but am I onto anything that you can respond to?
Well, are these ecosystems being made, I think is one part of that question.
So we're certainly trying to and are driving an ecosystem with content partners, with technology partners. Obviously, there are a rather small number of companies with very large distribution who I think could change the scale of that ecosystem and collaboration. With respect to your question, Bin, yeah, there's fundamental work that needs to be done, and that's why we need to get outside of that border. I think the point of the personal assistant shouldn't be to sell another version of the device or to improve how well we know a certain person for their profile. It should be for that person to be able to live their life more efficiently. And if we can recognize that and start working on it, the first thing we need to do is figure out how do these things all talk to each other and connect, and how do we share data.
It reminds me of the telecommunication industry in the early 70s. All the companies got together and started setting rules and standards among themselves. And, I think that needs to happen in a number of industries.
I agree. Standards sometimes make me shudder because it's often a race to the lowest
Talking about really
common
basic
denominator.
ones, like let's use the metric system instead of.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. Anyway, quick question.
Yeah, very quick. To universal literacy. If everybody has access to voice to text and text to voice on their phone or on some device, we don't have illiteracy anymore in the world. How close are we to making that happen in a way where we could distribute these in Africa or other places around the world?
Great question.
I love that question.
Yeah.
I'm really glad you asked it. And so we...
And you got about 10 seconds.
Yeah. There are 22 languages in India. We currently support 16 of them. We're going after the other 6. And that point is great from just a social perspective. I think it brings access to a huge number of fundamental services that we all take for granted: education, banking, healthcare, that suddenly become accessible to people who have phones but not computers, who have cell connections but not Ethernet. I think it's profoundly important and a huge opportunity.
Yeah.
Good. Let's talk.
Well, I wish we had more time, but Dan, thank you. And
Thank you.